I'm a notorious female sports fan on the show. I talk about sports to a degree that I think half our audience isn't that into. But I'm really embarrassed to say that I knew until reading your book very little about the National Women's Football League. Frankly, the only time I've seen women play football on TV was that, growing up, I would have NFL Network on, and they had that lingerie football league on, which at the time even as a kid, I went, there's something wrong here. I mean, what inspired you both to write this book? And I guess from a big picture view, what are your reflections on women's relationship to football in modern American culture?
I will say that you should not be embarrassed, because I know women's sports historians that have never heard of this league. So I think that that's pretty common. We did not know about this league either. And we came across it while researching a larger women's football project. We were trying to write a book about women in football much more broadly, and that book didn't sell. It didn't have much of a narrative arc, but in looking into that, we discovered the NWFL and the Toledo Troopers, the winningest team in pro football history. And in digging into their record, we found they were playing other teams, but we could not find anything else about those teams or about that league. And I think it became very quickly clear that this was the book that we wanted to write. And so we went from there. And I think, in terms of big picture thoughts about women's football, that's a big question. But I will say, for me, and Lyndsey may have something different to add here, but what was most surprising to me about writing this book was about how little has changed when it comes to the landscape of women's football, and how the leagues that are operating today are still operating very much in the vein of the way that the NWFL operated, on these shoestring budgets, selling raffle tickets to play games, not getting any money to be on the field, and things like that. And so I think for me, that was the most jarring, was really how little progress there has been in some ways.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that sentiment. Seeing the similarities and some of the same struggles and hurdles that women's football players and leagues and teams have to deal with today was kind of jarring.
Yeah, and what struck me really is in reading your book, how there's a kind of post-Title IX shift a little bit, but it doesn't really apply to football, right? I mean, tackle football is perceived as aggressive, and aggression is not incentivized as a quality for women and girls. And I can say this in terms of like politics a little bit. There are very few women in my field, because I think that there's a lot of times, or in progressive media specifically, because I think a lot of times speaking your mind to that degree about politics can be perceived as aggressive. Like, there have been gains made in soccer or in tennis for women and girls, not enough, but that's because they're more aerobic and less strength-based. And then that's some of the inherent misogyny in it as well, I would say. The aggression, strength building, that's more masculine, and that should not be something that women engage in. I'm curious about your thoughts on my read of those dynamics.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we talk about this a lot when we're discussing the book and the players and the league itself. There's this view in society, because football, like you said, is such a aggressive and violent sport, a very masculine coded sport, that society has a hard time wrapping their minds around women playing it, especially at the professional level. And, basketball, soccer, those sports that you mentioned, they're very much finesse sports. I mean, yes, there's physicality involved, but they're more, free flowing. And I don't know if that's more easily digestible for society, but yeah, we completely agree.
Right, because I mean, there was a passage in your book about some of the misogynistic ways that in the 1930s, I believe, there was an over 200-pound offensive lineman, female, was written about. What were some of the things that you found in your deep research on this? Because there was not a breadth of material at your disposal. Like, you can't just go on, whatever Pro Football Reference or the NFL database to find some of the stats that you need to see. You had to get a lot of firsthand accounts from people.
Yeah, we did. And a lot of our research, the beginning of our research comes from the newspapers, because these leagues and these teams were considered a curiosity. And so all the way back through history, in the 1930s, like you noted, there was some organized women's football being played. And those games, as well as the NWFL games, were covered very much as a curiosity. And the longer that the NWFL went on, the less media coverage there was. And the league was covered very much with a focus on the women's appearance. If they were very, very large women, that was played up. There was a lot of fat phobia and comments about the weight of, the linebackers. Or the linemen, excuse me. We had, if they were attractive, that was played up as well, because there is something threatening to the status quo about more masculine women. And so it was very important for reporters to play up when women were attractive so that they weren't seen as too threatening. And there was also this focus on the players being, women's libbers, because this is during the 70s, during second wave feminism. And so even though the players themselves didn't really associate with the movement, you see the newspapers really trying to shoehorn that in, and asking questions about their male partners and things like that. And so that coverage really is done through the lens of the people who are writing about it. And the people who were writing about it then were largely men. And so a lot of the research that we did came firsthand and from materials that the players had held onto. And we tried really to get their perspective back in, because it had been so thoroughly erased by the media at the time.
So I want to talk about, the NWFL's origins, but first I just kind of want to back up to talk about football's origins, because part of why this topic is important, it's not just women's sports in general, but the NFL is the most popular sport in our country, or football is. It is a cultural staple. I mean, that's part of why I enjoy it. I love the collectivism of it and the collective experience. But of course, that comes with like a massive exclusionary element, because the 50% of the population have not, roughly, have been historically excluded from that, both culturally and as players. So take us back to the late 1800s. Women's interest in football predates the NWFL, or NWFL, right, as you write.
Yeah, I mean, throughout our research, we discovered and found many examples of women participating in playing football, or trying to organize teams, and actually getting a few teams off the ground and having little round robins themselves, throughout the course of history since the sport was invented. The late 1800s, as you referenced, there was a a game between Yale and what was the other school? I think it was Harvard.
Harvard, Yale.
Yeah, Harvard, yeah. And they were putting on a men's social club event, and they gathered women from each school and pinned the school colors on them and had them play sort of like an exhibition game for fun and for entertainment for the guys. But when the women actually got on the field to play, I mean, they took it extremely seriously, and the game started, getting a little rough, and the police had to be called in because the crowd was getting really excited, and the whole description, in the newspaper at the time, could read like a scene out of a movie, and that just showcased really that early on that women, found interest in the sport and could play when given the opportunity, and so from there on, up until the NWFL kicked off, there were many times, as I said before, of women who tried to play, at high schools, or just, there was a high schooler in Alabama who went out for her team as a kicker at 17 years old, just to prove that she could. I mean, we could go back through and name a ton. And then eventually in the 1960s, there was a man by the name of Sid Friedman. He was a promoter and quote unquote sports agent for a baseball player, and he saw this sort of curiosity and the novelty of women's football, women playing football, sort of growing and catching on, and he decided just to create a team akin to the Harlem Globetrotters, women's football team, women's football troop, really, to play and compete against men teams around the Rust Belt area. He was from Cleveland, Ohio, and he got a team off the ground. And when he put out word in the newspaper to have women come try out, he got so many women who were interested, and not only interested, they really wanted to play and have the opportunity to play. And he formed a team, and they did play other men's teams, and they held their own. And so he decided to create another women's team, and then another women's team. And he sort of had this conglomerate of teams playing against each other throughout Pennsylvania and in Cleveland and in Buffalo, around those areas. And that's really what served as the launching pad for the NWFL, because owners around the country were honing in on this and decided to start teams in different parts of the country, and eventually got together separate of Sid Friedman to form the NWFL. But yeah, that's really sort of the timeline progression.